Hi, everybody. This is Bart Keijsers Koning, and we're going to be doing an interview with Tamara Johnson about her work and also her inclusion in this group show, which is greatly titled Breathing Amongst Werewolves. It also includes the work of Liz Cohen and Florian Demosthenes, Bea Gilles Gacha, Barbara Hammer, Io, and of course, Tamara. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a few installation views and then a couple of videos of the work, just because it is sculpture and we do need to kind of look around it. And I just wanted to take a chance to really talk with Tamara about some of the ideas that she has about her work, what's in it. I find it so challenging to speak about her work because I get so many things and then I tend to get lost really in how I speak about them. So I guess this will be more an education for me than for anybody else. But Tamara, do you want to say something, at least introduce yourself, etc.?
Sure. Tamara Johnson. I am a sculptor, an educator, and director of a sculpture park in Dallas. I grew up in Waco, Texas, so Texas native. I went to school up north and lived in New York for about 6 years before I moved back to Dallas in 2018 with my husband, Trey Burns. And yeah, I was teaching at SMU for a while, TCU for a while, and I'm currently actually in St. Louis teaching as a fellowship visiting artist at Washington University in St. Louis. So I've been kind of bopping around, but I'm happy to be here virtually with Bart to talk about this work that's up in Dallas right now.
Yes, it's such a great addition. It was a lot of fun to kind of introduce your work also in this context. And one of the ideas about the show is really kind of retaking a narrative from the patriarchy and showing the different facets that feminists or women artists or artists with different voices can have and can express themselves. And I think that's where you fit in so nicely for this particular show, because it is sculpture, and female sculptures are far and few in between. Not justly so, but you don't see a lot of them. It is unfortunate, as women do give such interesting perspectives on sculpture and 3D objects for that matter. When you walk into the show, you walk against gate with stars and a bungee. Remember, we were talking about how to install this. Do we make this an object that you actually kind of walk into? Does it function as a gate? And we decided, initially we were like, we'll do it sideways, kind of give more openness, but we decided for a kind of confrontation, and it works as such. It's kind of interesting because you can walk around it, you can walk around it, you can see it, and as you can see here from the images. But yeah, I still see in the audience that they'll stop and they'll mentally block themselves in front of your gate and not quite sure how to approach it. I think one of the funnier parts is also when we were installing it, as I was setting it down, because it's embedded into the concrete, one of the little stars came off, and you were frantically looking, and you were heavily picking these things up, and I'm like,
Yeah.
what the hell are you doing? I could buy one of these stars at the dollar store. And
Yeah.
you're like, Bart, it's gilded gold. And it
Yeah.
just really shows your care about not just the pieces, but you build everything from scratch. And I think that's something that's really needs to be iterated in these with this. It's that, yeah, you literally you begin from scratch. It's not like a metal gate that you buy at Home Depot, you kind of plop it in. I mean, these are very textured PVC layered in wax. The bungee cord is actually cast. I mean, why don't you tell a little bit more about
Yeah.
the technical process?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think back to your kind of concept for the show. I mean, for me, sculpture is body. So body is object, object is domestic, domestic is sculpture. So I have this kind of like flux between these themes a lot in my work. So, I kind of come from the school of the meticulous detail of material choice and the handmade. And I think that process for me is a conversation that works on multiple levels. Like on one level, I want there to be enough, kind of enough layers and enough juice and material and gooiness there for someone who is really looking for that. I think with other sculptors, we joke, when you're looking at sculptures or you're looking at objects, you want to figure out how everything's made. And I loved playing that game with myself, looking at other people's work. So I like there to be that conversation for someone who's really slowly looking and observing the material choices, but then also I think too about the broader picture of like, what is this thing? And I had been using the symbol of the fence, the gate, a lot in my work since I was living in New York, but I was looking kind of more at wrought iron fences, which were very common around the stoops in New York. So I was creating a lot of faux wrought iron kind of fences and installations and objects when I was in New York. So when I moved back to Texas, this gate is actually a replica of the gate that was in the house that we first rented in Dallas. And what I was really enthralled about with this gate was this idea of kind of keeping things out, creating this delineation of the backyard, public, private space, do not enter, territorial, kind of like these ways of mapping territories for the home, the gate that was in the house that we first rented in Dallas. And what I was really enthralled about with this gate was this idea of kind of keeping things out, creating this delineation of the backyard, public, private space, do not enter, territorial, kind of like these ways of mapping territories for the home, being an extended, from the home, the backyard or the front yard. And this gate was kind of this idea of like taking it out of that context and saying, well, it's not really a gate. It doesn't really have a function anymore. It's not really closing anything or keeping anything in or out. It's kind of just suspended in the middle of the room. So I did another one of these that was installed in a gallery in 2020. So this is kind of an iteration of another gate series. And for this one, it had some different elements. I was really thinking about the way to kind of mentally permeate or penetrate these types of delineations with objects, the idea of the fence and how we kind of move through them. And so the chain link was something that, back in 2020, it's COVID. So of course I'm like, well, I've got to teach myself how to weave chain link. So I figured that out. And this gate was constructed, like you said, from PVC and dowel rods and metal flashing and metal wire. And kind of like usually the way I work is like finding things that I have in the studio or very like simple ways to get to an idea very quickly. Because I do sketches, but a lot of times I sketch with just materials. So it's like, okay, what's going to work for this? I've got some rope over here. I've got like some sticks over here. Like put this together. I'll put some epoxy putty on it, just so I can kind of look at things.
Yeah, I know you wax them. I mean, that might not be totally clear. We'll look at it in a minute. Actually, let's look at it now. Do you want to talk a little bit about that idea of waxing and what that?
Yeah. So like I said, this kind of gate was really kind of beginning to become more anthropomorphized for me. I had this idea of like, you see these chain links that have kind of been cut or, in abandoned lots, people kind of break into spaces. So this idea of like the chain link that's kind of been opened by some other force to kind of get past that barrier. And then this idea of the bungee cord kind of supporting that effort. So saying like, this thing is open, this thing is supposed to keep me out. I've opened it. And now there's this other structural element that's going to keep that open for me.
But that's what I like so much about this. We intentionally put it up as a barrier, but it doesn't make sense in a way, it's like you can still permeate or go through, even though we can have to shrink ourselves and maybe go on a diet or two. But it's and that of course builds also the idea of penetration and domesticity. I mean, and that's something we actually spoke about quite a bit in what was so fascinating. And what I appreciate about your work so much is that you're not afraid of the term domestic. And, it's one of those words that I find very challenging to speak of, because it just has so much oppression and associations with that aren't always positive, yet we always look for it, and I think you tackling things like the ideas of suburbia or home, it's one thing we always escape from, as soon as we're like 16, 17 and we're gone. At least I was. And then yet you come back to it, and you create your sense of family or togetherness, whatever expression that may be. And I find that very interesting in your work. And that's also I must say, it must also be the challenge, no? Because it's funny to see people kind of be confronted with something they absolutely recognize. And then the context, of course, being a gallery or being a white cube for that matter, they don't know what to quite do with it. So how do you, I guess what my question would be, how do you get them to not get stuck into just familiarity of the objects, and kind of go past that moment? I mean, that must be quite challenging within your practice. There's another piece that we have here, which is, or we can talk about this a little bit here, because the bungee cord is cast, and then people like end up going fully into the bungee cord, and I'm like, yeah, bro, okay, there's a rest, there's a cowboy hat that's on top.
Yeah.
There's all these different elements that kind of go in. Do you find yourself lost like that as well sometimes in your pieces, that you just kind of over obsess about something and forget about the remainder?
I mean, I think it's like, I want to be fast and slow at the same time.
Yeah.
So like this gate, you can buy this gate, a gate that looks just like this at Home Depot for whatever, $50, $40. So if somebody walks in and sees that and thinks, oh, that's what it is, and walks past it, that's fine. I can't dictate every viewer, you know what I mean? So for me, it's like trying to give cues, both visually and materially, that might hold someone's attention for like longer than that initial like 3, 4, 5 second read. And as an artist, it's like you're successful sometimes and sometimes you're not, and so you lean into those like second, 10, 11, 12, and then that turns into minutes, and you try to focus on the person who's going to stick with it that long. But I think it's fast and slow. I try to find the larger picture of a symbol or an action. And then if somebody wants to be with it a little bit longer, there's like a reveal that happens.
Yeah.
Like there's some like the gold stars, if you really look at those, you can tell that they're not the stickers,
Oh, yes.
because you can tell that they're gold leafed. So, but you're not going to really see those just kind of walking past it, or even the bungee. You can see that the epoxy putty is like a little lumpy, and there are these like little flaws. So I try to use that kind of that flawed hand sculpted surface to kind of, I don't know, be an invitation for people to kind of hang a little bit longer.
Yeah, I think actually just the familiarity with the objects kind of pulls people in. I mean, it's pretty obvious as soon as you stand in front of them that these are not store-bought things, and I think that's the stars maybe is slightly more rewarding because you really have to pull into it and kind of get into that texture. No, but I find it so fascinating. I mean, now that I've seen it at the gallery and with an audience of how they interact with your work, and that kind of sheer joy. And I think the video we'll be playing next, which is it's a piece called Fence Post with Gummy Worms from 2022, 4.5 by 6.5 by 70 inches. Apologies for that. And it lays across the gallery floor. It's really a barrier that's then bent against and leaning against the wall. I love this piece. You just finished it right when we were talking about the show concept, and I kind of love this barrier that it holds, and that it absolutely makes no sense as far as function, and just. And then there's these little gummy worms made with kind of resin and diamond dust, I believe. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it just melts people. And I just love this kind of like people just stare at it and just kind of get lost in wonder. And then I love that kind of innocence that you were able to kind of play on it. But even though you're dealing with, because you mentioned prior with the gate, some words like the domestic and almost violence, which is kind of interesting that you touch on those subject matters with such, not innocence, but joyful things like
Yeah. Well, I think
playfulness.
humor is like a tool, like a really, really important tool for me.
Yeah,
Because, I think underneath it all, right? Like there's some, like I love for there to be like a darker underbelly to an object, but have this like very beautiful, funny surface read that's like anybody can kind of get pleasure from. I think a lot of times um things that are just beautiful maybe aren't, I don't know, they don't get maybe enough credit in the sculpture world. But for me, it's like having that pleasure in these little moments, but then also to kind of I like reference all the like people that I am influenced by and admire. I mean, the wood plank in an art historical context, is like everywhere, right? You think of like
mhm.
um um Charles Ray, doing those performances where he was kind of propping himself up with a plank of wood. And you think of Robert Gober, like creating his own 4x8 sheets of plywood, laminating the plywood himself. So this idea of like the piece of wood that you can buy at the hardware store, used for construction, used for building. I mean, those kinds of ideas are here. This idea of like this thing also turning into a body that's maybe kind of becoming like deconstructing into the ground, with the worms, I think Shakespeare said we're all worms meat. So, then also having the worms be this thing that's like the gummy worm, and then also too thinking about, well, how am I going to make the sugar coating of the gummy worms? Well, wasn't Warhol using that diamond dust on those
Yeah.
paintings that he did that like, or whatever? But so it's like kind of drawing in this kind of art historical context and materiality, that I also really like to play with. And I've been using concrete a lot in my work recently. So this is kind of like you said, a newer piece that's looking into kind of like figuring out very specific ratios and recipes for concrete, which is so much of sculpture is like baking, which is weird, mold making and
Yeah.
mixing and the properties of baking and the chemistry of these materials working together. So which is also kind of weirdly domestic. You think about like baking. So all this stuff for me is like it might seem kind of disparate elements, but to me, it's all in this like melting pot of materiality and the body and home.
Yeah,
But I also,
I'm
yeah,
sorry. No, I'm always amazed by your work, how um, balanced and assured it is. And I think that translates to the viewers really quite well, that because it's so intentional and it's so steadfast in its meaning, that your confusion of what am I looking at kind of dissipates, which I kind of admire. The conversations I have with people are quite fascinating, because it, it they just have these experiences, and they're not getting lost into, why is this plank laying on the floor? What is this doing here? It doesn't make sense. It just is, it becomes this relationship that they have to the piece. And I think that's in part because um, I guess you accept the viewer, it's you kind of accept that their presence, you accept that they are going to recognize these objects and that they have relationships to them, that they might even get lost into them, like as I mentioned before. And that you're okay with that is really brave, because it's I mean, we've mentioned that before. It's like, what are you going to now be known as, the gummy lady, the gummy sculptor? And it's like, but you're fine with that idea, and you just let it kind of go. And I think that confidence permeates through your choices. And I think, of course, it also has to do with your extreme talent and abilities of being able to make these things and make them work, make them out of cement. I mean, I know you're talking about them like, oh yeah, I just discovered cement. I mean, this is extremely difficult to make. I've worked with cement. It sucks. So,
yeah,
it's that, my things don't look anything like this. I mean, you can ask my wife. So it just, you know, there's enough confidence in your ability of execution. There's confidence in the way you're laying them down. It's not patronizing in any way. It's just it's really admirable, and a joy to kind of see. And I guess that will lead me to the third piece that's in the show, which is called Cheese. This is kind of a funny thing because not coming from, you know, America, I didn't know what this thing actually was. Of course, I understood it was cheese, but I had no relationship to it other than being Dutch.
Yeah, this is also too, like with concrete as a material. I've been looking at processed cheese as a material too. I mean, I really like this play of like high and low with materiality when I'm making work, you know. And so the properties of, you know, Velveeta cheese, which is a processed cheese. I mean, there's no real food in here. I mean, it's like oil and pigment, you know, that's processed and like congealed together into a package, which to me is like, oh, well, that's a sculpture, you know.
Yeah.
And then it's like something that we eat, you know. So based on this kind of like ubiquity of Velveeta cheese in the South with like recipes for queso, you know, there's stands in the grocery store with like stacks of Velveeta that you could just easily purchase. So this idea of like this Velveeta cheese being like just like a process of like a result of these materials being processed together, but then also taking the mold of the packaging to me is like very funny. And then also too that it has this kind of like flubbiness to it that's just like, well, it's just kind of like a weird body that's laying there. So I've been doing a lot of mold making and experimentation with Velveeta cheese, and I got some plans to do some more castings with it because you can also like melt it and like pour it, and then it congeals and hardens.
You mean the
And then
actual
it dries
cheese?
out. Yeah, it has all these different properties. I mean, it has like very similar properties to like concrete or plaster. So to me, that's like really interesting, just materially. And then like all of its phases, you know, you can pull metaphors from like when it's melted or when it's hardened or when it's kind of in this like
Sure.
state where you take it right out of the package and it's kind of like ripe for, you know, whatever you're going to do with it. So I had a lot of Velveeta in the studio, and the studio smelled terrible because the Velveeta has such a gross smell. And people were like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, I was like letting it dry out in different phases, so I had various Velveeta blocks, like at
Yeah.
various dried out stages,
Stages. That's
just to
disgusting.
kind of like watch it and see what it would do."
Can you still eat it
Um,
after you've done all this?
no,
No, I mean, I couldn't
I
even.
don't think so.
After I hear you talk about this, I never want to see this stuff.
No, it's
Um,
gross. It's gross, but like it's delicious at the same time.
I know, and I love the way it just lays into space. It's just like from the grooves that you really feel are embedded in it. I mean, it's like you know, it's very recognizable. Actually, I meant to ask you, do you actually bake?
You know, I'm not a good baker because I'm
Are you
not good at
serious? That's so
math.
funny.
You know,
Oh,
I'm
I
like,
would think you would like be such a
I
precise
know.
like tuck, 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 tuck.
No,
But
I mean, it's weird. I wish I were. I'm more of a cook. Like, I'm more of like, add this, like,
yeah,
get it to taste fine, like more spur of the moment. But I love like reading recipes and I love reading cookbooks. Um, but I usually kind of take it as a jumping off point. Like, I'll read a recipe or see something that
yeah,
I want to make and then kind of like put my spin on it. But you know, with a lot of these materials too, like if you're working with silicone or concrete, I mean, there's always like the person who's really intense and super nitpicky with, you know, the way in which you measure out the materials. And there's different silicones and rubbers that, you know, have different,
may require
more mathematical ratios. I always get the easiest stuff, like 1-to-1, easy mix.
some
You
water.
know what I
There you
mean?
go. Yeah.
Make it easy for myself, you know, because I really care a lot about the result, you know. So however I get to that kind of final point, whatever, however I need to get there as quick as I can. Um,
Yeah, because it's
but
interesting with the way I've seen you work. I mean, as far as like coming to your studio and kind of, you know, besides you talking about the work, I've seen elements and witness elements that you build up. I mean, I one of the scenes, I mean, just to describe it to the audience now is kind of you have a tendency to make things and let them rest and then kind of play with them. So you're almost building components to create your sculpture. And I think that's allows you that kind of freedom to be like, okay, we're going to push it this way, because what you're describing as far as like making a material or it's very determined. You have to like the beginning to an end. You can't change halfway, because when you're casting something, that's what it's going to be. Yet your approach to your work is very much is a very open approach, and meaning like you can change your mind as you're building these. So it's I guess you as a sculptor, you're more and more of a I mean, not to pigeonhole you in any way, but like more of like a builder, and in a
Yeah.
sense of taking these components and seeing where that then goes. And I think you kind of like that freedom as well, which is interesting because you work so much with molds, it's which are very much determining what you're going to get at the end.
Yeah.
Where did you actually learn most of your mold making? And because I mean, it's such an important practice, you're really good at it.
Yeah, I mean, it initially started when I was at the University of Texas in Austin. I had a professor there named Jack Stoney who was kind of like a master mold maker. So he kind of got my interest peaked with a lot of my mold making skills in undergrad. So I kind of kept those going and developed those. And I was just trying to early on, like, see the weirdest things I could cast. Like, can I cast like a fish head? Can I cast like McDonald's French fries? Like, how do I do this? And then later on, when I was in New York, I worked for Robert Gober's studio. And so a lot of my mold making background really helped in that position. And then while I was there, I learned so many more materials and techniques. And I worked, a lot of the other employees who were there while I was there, were also really skilled. So it was kind of like a great sharing of ideas and skills and kind of institutional knowledge around mold making, because everybody does it different. I mean, it's kind of like baking. It's like you can have a recipe for chocolate chips, but like everybody's chocolate chips are going to taste a little different. So, and Bob included, like he was also super talented and was always working in the studio with us at the same time. So, it was like a very fruitful place to have as my job for about 6 years.
That's amazing.
So, yeah, it was incredible.
I mean, intimidating as well, just because it's such, uh, a great mind at the same time, and such an influence, and to then be able to kind of pull yourself out of it, maintain your own identity, and you create your own shape and form. It's really impressive. Tamara, I just really want to say thank you so much for sharing all these details about your work. I loved being able to walk through the show with you, and learning a little bit about where you're coming from, and being able to kind of share that with the audience as well, because I think it's an enriching process. It's and it's very rewarding to see your work, and I just love the way people look at your work. It's so much fun, and that said, I hope people take a chance to come see it within the show. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great. I love the videos. It's the best way to document sculptures, like
But exactly, just
360.
like get in there and get through it, right?
Yeah, it's great.
All right, I'll talk to you soon,
Awesome.
and thank you.
Okay,
All
thanks
right,
so much.
bye.